Our next session will be moderated by Roy. How does he pronounce the last name? Snell. Right, Snell. We're going to be taking a look at the next sort of wave of compliance. As our panel is set up, thank you all. And Roy, let me hand the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much. Those of you who weren't here yesterday morning, my name is Roy Snell. I'm the CEO of the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. And before we start, I just want to thank Justin. Adam and I have visited with their organization over the last few years, and they're doing a great deal to promote compliance all over the world. They have taken a publication written by Joe Murphy called Compliance on $1 a Day, helping countries that do not have a great deal of money to devote to this sort of thing to try and help them proceed further along in the area of compliance, which frankly is just going to help all of the issues that he discussed. As I was sitting down here thinking before we got started that this may be the most distinguished panel ever assembled in compliance in a certain way. These are the 4 least likely people to listen to a moderator, and will be more fun than a human ought to have. And I think it's kind of nice that we're ending the general sessions at this conference with some of the most knowledgeable people in our profession. I want to start with Odell Guyton, seated in the middle. Many obviously know Odell. He's a former compliance officer at Microsoft. He's currently a compliance officer at J-Bills, one of those huge multinational companies that you've never heard of. Odell is really one of the most knowledgeable people on implementing compliance programs in a multinational company, taking into consideration different cultures, different laws, distributed people in the compliance department. And frankly, he's one of the greatest orators in our profession. He is one of the greatest speakers. He can capture a crowd like few others can. I'd like to introduce second down on the end, Art Weiss, which may be not Weiss.
You got it right.
And Art, when I was thinking about what I could say that was significant about Art is that I thought of an Albert Einstein quote that if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Our profession is plagued by people outside of our profession trying to describe compliance programs and compliance officers despite having spent very little time with us or in the role. Art, on the other hand, is the kind of person that this organization looks for and tries to put in to a position to help those who are starting out in the profession in particular, because Art understands it. He understands how to explain it to people in a way that makes it simple. And frankly, compliance programs and the role of the compliance officer is a relatively simple concept that is only made complicated by those who want to be involved and aren't really knowledgeable. And he and frankly all these folks have been involved in our academies all over the world and have helped fight the misinformation and lack of understanding of our role and the role of the compliance program. Marjorie Doyle, I'm going to read it. And my first thing is Marjorie Doyle has been in compliance since dirt.
Are you calling me old?
Yeah.
You're calling me old.
You were a millennial at one point in your life.
Let it go.
Marjorie Doyle first captured our attention a long time ago when she was at DuPont, former compliance officer at DuPont.
Right.
Y'all heard, by the way, Art was is at Tamco, was at Sears. Marjorie was at DuPont and Vetco. And what captured our attention is this panel is really about the future and of the compliance programs and compliance officers. It's not about the future technology. It's not next-gen technology or next-gen automation of compliance. It's about the trend of compliance and what we'll see down the road. Marjorie, I would argue, was 15 years ahead of her time, and frankly, she was at a place most of us aren't even at now. She convinced her organization to publish the disciplinary actions that were taken on employees, without mentioning their name, in a company newsletter, which was profoundly effective in trying to tell people, we do more than talk, we're serious. If you think about doing something like this, this is what's going to happen to you. And if you think about doing something else, you understand that this is not a paper tiger. Our compliance program means something. And I still see very few people doing things like that. Last but not least, Debbie Troklas, who has probably done more for this profession than any other single volunteer. Debbie helped co-found this organization in its original form, focused on healthcare nearly 20 years ago. Most importantly, Debbie took over and former compliance officer at Louisville, lots of experience. But she founded the certification program. And I'm not keeping up on the numbers well enough, but I think we're close to 9,000 people who are certified either in healthcare or in all industries or internationally. And the amount of work that she and others who have helped her put into this is just stunning. And when we look back at this 30 or 40 years from now and say who was there, who helped make this more successful, she's going to be on the short list. The credibility the certification has brought our profession is tremendous and can't be really measured. It's unbelievable value that Debbie has brought in many other ways also. Again, this panel is about the trends in compliance programs and the role of the compliance officer. And just to give us a little starting point, so that maybe the speculation about where things are going to be a little bit relevant. Debbie, you and I met about 20 years ago at a conference we had put together, and you were an interim compliance officer, and I came to you and said, we want your help in getting this thing going, and you said, I'm interim, I don't know if I'm even going to be doing this. Now you're in the heart and soul of the profession. How were things different then? What was it that life was like for you when they came to you and said, be the compliance officer? How much did you know about the role?
Well, I can tell you that I can remember the day like it was yesterday. It was August 1996, and I went on vacation, and I got a phone call. It was my boss, and he said, Debbie, when you come back off vacation to the university, I want you to start a compliance program. I said, I don't know anything about compliance. And he said, don't tell anyone. Well, at that time, it sort of ruined my vacation, but I came back and I started Googling compliance and trying to figure out what I was going to be doing, and I felt lost. There was nothing there. There was nothing on the internet. There were no associations like this, no one to help. And I guess my big question was, what really is compliance? And I think what's really transferred since then to today is, my feeling of being lost has now been replaced with my sense of community, the relationships that we've developed, the profession that we've developed. It's just amazing. No one here to help. Now we have a multitude of resources. If nothing else, I can call these guys and say, what do I do? I've never heard of this. And, I still get those things on a daily basis. And then the last question I had was, what really is compliance? Now we have a profession. And I think that it's gone a long ways, but I think today we all know what compliance is. It's not rocket science. And like you said earlier, I think people make it more difficult than it really is.
20 years ago, I was in a state attorney general's office, and when we would deal with organizations, we would deal with governmental relations and the legal department. There was no such thing as compliance. And then when I got to Sears, compliance consisted primarily of filing the SEC statements and responding to letters from government agencies. There were no proactive programs. There was no profession of compliance 20 years ago, at least not outside of healthcare.
Yeah. And my path is very much like I think a lot of people here. And by the way, we may be pioneers, but we got a bunch of pioneers out in the audience. So
we're not the only old ones?
We're not the only older than dirt.
Marjorie, I left my Conestoga wagon in my.
But here I was at DuPont. I was head of litigation. I thought I was going to die doing that with my boots on. And my GC, who I swear at the time did not like me, said, "You have to also go out and find out about this compliance stuff. I don't know anything about it." What a blessing. What a true blessing. And I very much like Debbie, there was nobody to call, so I would look at different conferences. There was nothing like this, bits and pieces, and slowly would come back and create what I thought this role was. The great comfort is, and what's so amazing when I look at this, we got 1,600 people here, and yet we are a profession where the founders are still alive. The pioneers are still alive. And now we're, yeah.
That's for you, Marjorie.
Stop it. And I think we're in the settler stage. We clearly have a profession. It's still something we have to fight for. But my goodness, go in that exhibition hall. Look how many exhibitors there are. When you got exhibitors out wanting to give you services and take your money, you got a profession going, okay? Yeah. So I think that's where we are. And to Debbie's point, there's a comfort. I know where I can go to seek help.
Yeah, I think none of you ever need to feel that you don't know and there's no place to go.
Yeah.
Because there's always someone in our profession that's willing to help you.
Well, when I got to TAMCO, I was told to start the company's first compliance and ethics program, and I had no idea how to do that. And so the first thing I did was start looking on the internet for conferences, and I found the Institute. And so I go to Chicago 10 years ago and start meeting with people. And there were a lot fewer people around in this room back then. And we took the very first certification exam. Now I think I saw a flyer on the table that says half of our attendees here are certified,
Wow.
which is, I think, amazing.
Odell, any comment?
Yeah, when I had a different entree into compliance. As you may or may not know, I was a former federal prosecutor, and when I came into the U.S. Attorney's Office, it was the first time that we were utilizing the individual sentencing guidelines. Organizational guidelines came out a little bit later in 92. I started in 88. And at that time, it was a big push for RICO prosecutions. And in RICO prosecutions, you could actually control the assets of a company that was deemed to be in violations of certain predicate statutes. And so the government started taking over companies. And we even started seizing the assets of drug dealers who had now purchased farms and businesses and things like that. And then finally we realized, because we were seizing horses and other farm animals, that we didn't know what the hell we were doing. And to be a CEO on a seized asset was not the thing you wanted to do. So the Marshal Service refused to take our horses and refused to take our cows. But when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, I joined a group of former federal prosecutors, and we began to do preventative law. And one of those was to use the sentencing guidelines for organizations to put in compliance programs where our clients were now the targets of federal investigations. And we would say to them, you know, had you had a compliance program, you would not be in the position you are now. And their response was, well, our general counsel said we never needed one. Well, you know, that's a big change. And so when I began to put these compliance programs in, and when I then later came in-house, the first question I would hear is, compliance with what? We want to know how you fit in. The big change that I see now, nobody asked that question, you know. And I think that's critical because we are now on the map, and not only are we on the map, but we are building the foundation for something else. The other thing that's very critical here is that, if you really do compliance well, you know that it's not just the idea of complying with prescriptive law or policy. What we do is we monitor behavior. We monitor behavior of our employees. We monitor behavior of our companies so that we don't get close to that prescriptive line, so that we don't get over that prescriptive line. And we challenge the C-suite. We challenge the governing organization of our companies to be accountable for that conduct, not just in words, but in deed.
Thank you, Odell. One of the things we talked about, Debbie, when we were putting together this panel is you suggested something that insightful observations to me are things that people say about something that everybody's talking about, but they say something that hasn't been said and are kind of profound. So we're all talking about the future and trends, and you made an observation none of us was making, that the future is going to be different for everyone here. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, I think when we talk about the future, what we're trying to talk about is the future of the profession. So where is the profession going? But I think professionally, for a lot of us, the future's different. We're at different stages in our ball game. Some of us are just starting in compliance. Some of us are midway through developing a program. Some of us have had programs in place for 10, 15, 20 years. So our futures look a little bit differently. So I think when I think about the future and I think about actually defining that, I think it's just looking to mature your program, and where you are today, just look at making it better, taking one step ahead, because we're not all on the same page.
I think also, though, that those of you who are new to the profession, who are newbies, your trajectory will go much quicker, because you can see some things that we didn't see. Mm-hmm. And I think that will help you get up to speed much more quickly. I think there's a group of us who've been in it a while who need to be thinking of still, where are we going? Because you're never done. So I think there's some trends that we want to see. I mean, just look at Justin. We had the Department of Commerce come here. Last year we had the FBI. We gave an award to the UN last night. One of the trends I see that shows we are a profession is we are informing them formally who we are. They know who we are. And I see this trend sort of really involving governments in our profession in two ways. Not just enforcement, but government agencies have people too, and we are seeing them have compliance officers. Sitting in this audience today are members from the FBI, from NSA, from other government agencies who have worked on their programs. And we also see this trend of this is beyond the U.S. We have 150 people here who are members who come from outside the U.S. who are thirsting for this identification with a profession. All of that, I think, makes us more real and institutionalizes who we are.
Marjorie, I think you're right. I think one of our successes and one thing that's made us so effective as a profession is really our collaboration with our government officials. Mm-hmm. We haven't tried to fight them. We haven't tried to lobby against them. We have tried to work with them. We have them at our conferences. We train them in our academies. And I think it's that hand-in-hand working relationship that we have with them that helps them understand what we're doing and also helps us understand what they're doing.
Well, and as I mentioned last night, if you weren't here for the dinner last night, the U.S. Sentencing Commission's General Counsel acknowledged that we are a group of what they call compliance professionals. Mm-hmm. And we've gone from, in 1991, fighting the implementation of the guidelines, not us fighting it, but to now we're sharing best practices. So we are now moving that direction, and we now have the attention of the Sentencing Commission, and they acknowledge that we are here and that we are professionals in this new profession.
Well, what I see is a number of new players to the field. Mm-hmm. When we started, it was either the OIG for healthcare or occasionally the Department of Justice. Now we have the SEC, we have Department of Commerce, we have the Wall Street Journal having a daily column about compliance activities. Last night we have the FCPA blogger. So the things that we do now, no matter how big, no matter how small, are attracting the attention of major players in industry and business. And the thing that we have to do, to be mindful of, is we have to get it right. Because the more exposure we have to these bodies, the more accountability we're going to have for control within our company on compliance matters. And I was reading a few articles the other day that suggest that now compliance officers will have personal liability for failing to get it right. And indeed, in the European privacy setting now, the compliance officer in privacy is expected to report violations of their company's conduct directly to the government. And then there's direct criminal liability on a compliance officer for failing to do that. So the more we do, the more we're expected to do, and the more accountability is on our shoulders. And what we have to also understand is we're not responsible for compliance.
That's right.
It's the business that's responsible
right.
for compliance.
And to Adele's point, I think the great thing that has happened is we are defining our profession about who we are. And the great thing is every time we get together here in academies or wherever it is, we are walking out of here all holding hands with a clear picture of who we are and what our responsibilities are, not the lawyers telling us who we are, not the HR people telling us who we are, not whoever it is. We are defining who that is. And I think when we walk out of here with that confidence, that gives us the strength. When we have pushback in our organizations about who are you and are you trying to take my stuff or here, take this wretched refuse or whatever it is, we can say, this is who we are and this is what our responsibility is. And to your point, compliance is not our responsibility. We are coaches, counselors, best practice, and we are here to assist management.
And I want to add to that, Adele, there are compliance officers who are being criticized or gone after by the government for not having done something, but I don't consider them compliance officers. Compliance officers don't do compliance for the organization. People who are supposed to submit SEC filings and other things may be gone after, but no true compliance officer is going to be legitimately prosecuted by the government if they're a true compliance officer not doing compliance for their organization. They are helping everybody in the organization who does file those sorts of reports and things be more effective. One other thing I want to say is I thought it was really an interesting comment that it's very interesting to be a part of an industry or profession that just started. And many people here came from other professions, HR, audit, legal, and others. Those professions have been around in some cases for 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. The pioneers are long gone. Right. The folks who were involved in the early startup are long gone. Many, there's some that are not here, but many of the people that were involved in helping this profession roll out properly are in this room, and I don't think we reflect on that enough. That 100 years from now, I think it's likely this profession will still be here. It's possible this profession could be here 1,000 years from now. And 1,000 years from now, much like the legal profession meets and has panels like this today and wonders about who started the whole thing, it's a rare chance for us to say, you all started this. I want to ask you another question about one of the most important elements of an effective compliance program, I believe, is the independence of the compliance officer. Where was it? Where is it? Where is it going to be?
Well, you know where it was, and it still is in a lot of companies, and don't be disheartened by it, but it was reporting to the general counsel. It was a secondhand thing that the GC or legal had, or it was in audit, but it was an afterthought. Okay, that's where it was. And when I say don't give up because some of you are still there, I just say, work towards it. Independence is absolutely crucial to what we're doing. And we are all very clear that the best practice is for the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer to report directly to the board. Now, when you go in your organizations and you say this, you will hear this, oh my, heresy, all this sort of thing. But we really are the ones that have to not only be part of the company, but be able to step aside and speak with the board, who is the ultimate independent. And you know what? That's happening. We actually have examples. I had one of our members, one of our academies, Debbie, who called me up about a year ago and said, Marjorie, I'm getting ready. I'd been at the academy. I believed what y'all said. So I have an audience with the board to propose that our position report directly to them. Can you please give me some examples of other companies that have done this? And we all know that management never likes to be the first one. They like the comfort of knowing somebody else has done it and it's okay. Thanks to our organization, I could rattle off some companies that have done that. She called me back at 8 o'clock that night and said they went for it. Now what do I do?
I drank the Kool-Aid, right?
Okay, you got that far. We can take it from there. I think that is the best practice, and we're actually seeing it happen. So when people push back on you, it's not a crazy idea.
So Marjorie, how do those that are having that difficulty, what advice do you give them to how to reach their board? How do you inform the board and educate the board?
Well, that's another trend I think we've got is I'm seeing more and more people are getting an audience with the board and educating your board. I think that's going to be your next best buddy, okay? Because management may push back against you and not understand, but if the board is telling management and showing support, you've got it. So I think it starts with educating your board, not just we have a compliance program and the board says, fine, don't worry my pretty little head about anything else. But instead you say to the board, you've got to know the elements and here are the questions you should be asking management about each of those elements. And when the board then goes and asks management, do you have enough resources? Give me the metrics on training, on how effective is the program. That's when you're going to get the support. And we're seeing that have traction. And we're seeing more and more boards as they have near misses and get scared. And thank you, by the way, for the Yates memo. If it takes scaring them to death, so be it. Then I think when they get some understanding and start asking management, that's where we're going to get yet another portion of traction.
In talking, Marjorie, about the Yates memo and the emphasis on sentencing individuals and starting to look at individuals, it gives me, I guess, a little bit of pause to think that how is that going to affect our hotlines, our reporting systems, folks in our organization coming forward and saying, I did something wrong. What can I do to take care of this? How do you all think that that's going to impact that?
Well, that's a terrific question because we all know when stuff comes up like this, there's a dark side,
right,
and a positive side. So I think we need to be prepared for that. It was just like when we have all the whistleblower things. All of us in this profession said, "Oh my gosh, whistleblowers are going to go straight to the government as opposed to utilize what we have set up." And I think we just hunkered down and said, that means we better have a really good communication process where people feel free to speak up. So I think, Debbie, your point is really good because it can shut down things. And we may have people in our company say, the sky's falling, it's going to shut it down. And I think we have to look on the bright side and say, that just means this is how we're going to handle it, and we're going to take that as a positive tool.
Odell?
Well, I just want to say one thing so that everybody, I hate to say this, is on the same page.
He's
Right.
a baby boomer.
Right.
But the Yates memo, for those of you who may not know what it was the
Yeah.
Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Department of Justice actually sending out a memo reminding prosecutors, because this is not a new concept in prosecution, that even though you may seek an indictment against a company, a business, we always look, meaning we, the Department of Justice, always look to the accountability of individuals first before we actually go against the company. And what that did was reinforce the prosecution principle that a corporation is responsible for the actions of its agents and its employees, and that even though you have strong culpability against the company, you need to go after the individuals who are responsible for that conduct and also go after the company. It's called a gatekeeper concept as well. And you know about a gate, right? You open it and then you close it, right? Who was in the position to actually keep that gate open when this conduct was occurring? Who did not close the gate? So that's what it's focused on. But again, tying it back to the independence of the compliance officer, there's that expression, be careful what you ask for, because you just may get it. And you have to know the difference between reporting to the board and providing reports to the board. That's not the same thing. But the independence of the compliance officer is to give the compliance officer that escape valve when there's conduct in the company that they cannot tolerate, and they're being stopped at a higher level, to be able to go outside of their chain of command to the highest authority in the company and to either go up the ladder or explain what's going on. But the important thing about that also is you have to have a relationship with the board. You have to be able to have had some kind of structure in place when you took the job that somehow or other that was known to be what your role is. Okay? And now I think it's an even greater, risk to companies, because now the SEC and its whistleblower actions have said, yes, compliance officers can be whistleblowers. Now, I'm not suggesting we go out and all be whistleblowers, because that's not something that the profession would actually benefit from. But you can see that there are a lot of players in this now, and the rules are always changing, evolving. It's up to us to make sure that we're on top of those rules, to make sure that we understand what our roles are and what our role is not, so that we don't get caught up in a web of conduct that has nothing to do with what we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
So do you all think that some of these things that are occurring right now, the Yates memo, the VW situation, and some of the other things that are going on, is that going to impact leadership in such a way that will cause them to be more supportive of compliance in the future, or more interested or more involved? Would they look at the compliance officer differently in the future as a result of the things that seem to be occurring recently that should be catching their attention?
I think they will, once there are a few examples out there to catch their attention. Just to have a memo and talking about it, they're not going to do it. But as soon as you have real examples of peer companies, of individuals who are close to the CEO and CFO, where their peers are actually getting tagged with such conduct,
Right.
And
then you'll see
and you're still fighting that it'll never happen to me thought.
Yeah.
Right. But I think here is where getting together like we are, getting a heads up about what's coming, I think it gives us a hook to go back to our board, to our executives, our management team, and say, here's some bad stuff that can happen. We've got an answer. We wanted to spend time with you, educating you. Now maybe you can find time, okay? Because we're going to tell you how to be supportive and how to make you more comfortable and what the new lay of the land is. Because we've all had to fight. The executives on the board are so busy, they don't have time. The little people, go train the people at the plants. And yet, it's the folks at the level there that need to give us more time. I think we ought to use this as a hook and do it in a positive way. You want to know how we can help you? We can help you.
I want to ask a question about that in just a second, but first, Art, I think that your organization has greater leadership commitment than any organization I've ever seen. So in a sense, getting to Debbie's point, your future is different than the future of some of the folks out here. But it just so happens that you talk to these people at the academies all the time. You hear their stories, you hear the different varying levels of support of their leadership. So answering not for your company, but for the folks in this room that you've talked to, so many all over the world really, where do you think we are with regard to leadership support? And do you feel comfortable that what you've heard over the last 5 years of asking these questions of these people, is leadership support improving, and will it continue?
I think it is, and I think the best example of that is we've had over the past several years, we will have the general counsel and or the compliance officer from an organization come in and go through the academy, and the next thing you know, the entire staff is going through. And so it is working its way throughout the organization. They're getting management support for this. I think particularly outside the U.S., because this is newer to them, like somebody said, the passion is really there. They are really thirsty for this knowledge and this information because basically, the people in our profession want to do the right thing. And they get frustrated if management doesn't support them. But I think we're seeing their passion and their enthusiasm is actually playing well with their management because they're getting the support to come to these.
I'm going to ask you a strange question related to this. The United States and other countries have decided that they want their companies to follow the rule of law and behave ethically. It's on the news every other night. It's discussed on the network news. It's discussed on the cable news. It's one of the highest priorities, it seems to me, in this country and many other countries at this time. Our professional association is growing at 20% a year. The number of people that are getting certified is growing at about the same rate. This meeting is now up to 1,600 people. It's stunning how much awareness there is, and we know about the solution, the best solution, preventing, finding, and fixing ethical and regulatory problems. I want to ask this panel a question. You've been at this for 20 years each, 80 years collectively or whatever. Can you recall a time, let me set this up just a little bit more. So Penn State, Enron, VW, the news is awash for a week or so afterwards. Experts are brought in, a lawyer is brought in to discuss that they're innocent and the government's overreaching. Another lawyer says that they're guilty and it's horrible, and an ethicist comes in and says everybody's terrible. Tell me the number of times the four of you have seen network news discuss the most effective solution to preventing, finding, and fixing ethical and regulatory problems to this huge issue of corporate wrongdoing. How many times have you heard this solution of a compliance officer and compliance program mentioned on national news?
I don't think I've ever heard it.
Not at all.
Zero.
They don't talk about it. They don't know about it.
Stunning to me.
They want to get the public all in an uproar. And, you really read my mind because I was sitting here thinking about, when I first started and where we are today in the future. I know when I first started, we all were hearing about compliance, and we would talk in our little community of compliance officers about compliance. But the public really didn't know about compliance. I can remember sitting on an airplane and somebody'd say, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a compliance officer," and you'd spend the rest of the time telling them what that was. Not too long ago, I had someone say, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a compliance officer." So he said, "Oh," and that was it. End of the conversation. Because they know what I do. So what the media is doing is they get the public all in an uproar, regardless of what the end result is, regardless of what the penalties are, or regardless of what the corrective action plans are. They're really the root cause of the problem. And that's all they see. And so it starts to damage huge organizations that really shouldn't be damaged at all because that's all the public sees. And they're starting to get a heightened awareness of really what they think compliance is, what the media says compliance is.
But see, we have a different mindset. When I first heard about VW, all they're talking about is how much the stock dropped and how many billions of dollars of equity they lost. And the first thoughts that came to my mind was, okay, what process got missed here? What did they not do? And I'm trying to think, how did this happen? And the press is only talking about the dollars.
That's right.
But you started to see on the VW situation, there were some discussions. In fact, Charles Elson, who's well renowned in board circles, and in fact was on our board for several years, started talking about the culture. So I think you're starting to see, if you get past the scare 'em kind of news, you start reading about what was wrong there.
Yeah, but because the culture is being discussed and the ethicists are on the national news, and we got to, it's the tone at the top. They talk about all that, but there's another piece of this that is just not being discussed that frustrates me personally, is that how about going out and looking for the problem, finding the problem, and fixing the problem? And it's just stunning to me, and frankly, just for those of you in the audience who are thinking maybe the National Association or the SECE should be doing something about this, we hired a New York PR firm for 6 months, a great group of people. They tried very hard. They had connections into the national press. We had a few phone calls, and frankly, the conversation went something like this. Roy, are you willing to tell us how terrible this company that just had this problem is? And I said, no, I'm willing to talk to you about the solution to this problem. Click. There is no interest in the solution, and it's stunning to me. And I would like to ask you all if you think that any time in the next 5 or 10 years, will the word compliance officer or compliance program be uttered in the national news, NBC, CBS, Fox, CNN, in the next 5 years? Do you think anybody with any compliance experience will come on board and say, you might look at this as a solution?
Maybe, because you know what? Here's the thing in our profession. Our jobs are never done. There's no silver bullet. And something we do that nobody else does is we actually implement solutions. One of the great things about all the classes we've had here today and talking to people is, what did you actually do? What was successful? What was not? And I think we got to keep plowing ahead at that, because while everybody else is losing their heads and screaming how terrible and how awful, we're saying, okay, how do we work on this? How do we prevent it next time? Anybody can sit and state what the 7+ rules are, okay? We can all do that, and somebody can do it. What we as professionals do is the skill set on how do we implement that with our organizations.
Well, I sure personally wish there was a way we could do a better job as an organization to help make more progress. And I did say yesterday morning that we have made great progress in 20 years. I'm the most impatient person in the world. I'd like to see more. I'd like to get back to the Yates memo, because I think the Yates memo is potentially tied to so many different things that we could talk about the future. Let me just ask the group this one question. And again, we want to clarify that the Yates memo was written by the Department of Justice. In my opinion, it reflects the last 5 or 6 years of frustration by the press, the public, the politicians, and the prosecutors about the fact that, particularly in the financial services industry, that people didn't go to jail for the problems that occurred. They have had this anxiety for years. They formalized it in a memo. They're going to add policies that say, and the most interesting line in the whole thing, I think, is the one that's, I believe, double underlined. If you don't give us the investigations you have conducted on individuals, you will not get credit for any of your compliance efforts. Some are saying it's the same old talk, very few people go to jail, it's not going to change. Others are saying it could be a very material change. Some are saying it's a game changer. Let me ask this question. At a minimum, it's an important document. That the Department of Justice felt it was this important to write this document. And share it with the world. I would bet 92%, 99% of the people in this room's leadership has no clue what the Yates memo is. And the Yates memo is essentially targeting the C-suite. Now, there'll be people in the mid-range and the lower level that will also be prosecuted in the future, probably. To what degree, we don't know. But the message is very clear from the Department of Justice. We're not talking about the people at the bottom. We're talking about the people in leadership roles in the organization. Here's my first question. Should compliance professionals share the Yates memo with their leadership, CFO, CEO, COO, or anybody else in the organization?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay, I like that nice short answer. Very good,
Yes.
because I have a follow-up question.
Yes.
Okay, we haven't had a lot of time to think about it. This
You
is
think yes?
This is a panel on the
absolutely. That's better
future.
than yes.
We had 4 yeses, 4 correct answers.
4 answers. Yes.
And
we get
by
a
the
prize?
way, I have an award at the end of this for the most outstanding panelist. We'll all be on pins and needles until the end to see who wins the award.
And we're baby boomers, right? So we need that award.
So I'm going to ask you to try and think on your feet here. We have not had much time to digest the Yates memo. We haven't much time to the future. So you're suggesting somebody share it. How do they do it? Let's say the Yates memo, my guess, is about as long as my notes here, 4 or 5 pages. I don't know. I can't remember. They hand the whole thing? Or do they discuss it? Is it in a meeting? Do you have any advice? Seems to me this would be a good thing to think about before you do it.
No question about it. I mean, I don't know. I kind of nodded my head yes about sharing the physical Yates memo because they won't understand it, right?
Good point. So what would you do as an alternative?
Well, I would talk about that it's not just that it's a sea change, it's that this is what you're expected to do, particularly if you're a Section 16 officer. And you don't have to just go to the Yates memo. You can go to the cases where the SEC has reemphasized the theory of a control person. You go to some of their cases, Nature Sunshine case, where they prosecuted the executives for failing to abide by their own internal policies. They failed the controls. It's back to that gatekeeper again. And so the Yates memo, while it's fresh today, the precepts of prosecution have always been there. And if they're not accountable for their own individual conduct at that level, then there's nothing the memo is going to do. And not that I know anything about the VW situation, but it seems to me that somebody in there decidedly said, I'm going to design this to fool the public. Now that is intent, right? And I'm going to design this and I'm going to market this that we have this totally non-polluting vehicle when it actually pollutes 40% more when it's actually on the highway. So it was designed, engineered to job the test. Now, if that's not criminal intent,
Right.
But this is not a new concept.
It's not a new
as you alluded
It's
to
not a new
before.
concept.
There was almost the same language in the McNulty memo, saying
Exactly.
it's not just the corporation, go after the individuals.
Yeah.
And I think we ought to have a little bit of caution and not run and think the sky is falling, particularly with the cooperation piece that you mentioned, because we went through this same sky is falling on cooperation with attorney-client privilege, and that managed to resolve itself. I think they're reaffirming their philosophy, and it is an ancient philosophy in criminal law.
Marjorie?
Let's stop with the lawyer stuff. Because
Okay.
that's not, I mean, I'm a lawyer, we have a lawyer background. We are compliance professionals. We've crossed over to the
Dark
bright
side.
side.
to the right
bright side.
Bright side.
The
Okay?
enlightened side.
So one of our responsibilities when we go through the 6th step is consistent discipline. Okay? So I think what this is talking about is your organization. Have you been giving consistent discipline to people at the top the way you do at the bottom?
I don't believe in consistent discipline for the people at the top. I think the people at the top should be held to a higher standard.
Well, I agree with that. He's convinced me that quickly.
If you were to share, I'm with you, Art. I do think we have to be really careful not to overreact. On the other hand, somebody on the board or in the C-suite could say to us, this thing's been 6 months from now, this thing's been 6 months. They declared war on leadership, and you didn't tell me about this?
Oh, no, we still have to educate them about it. I just think we need to be careful.
You agree, educate, but I think you wisely say, be careful not to oversell. You might say this has been discussed for years. This could be meaningful, it might not be. So what I think Odell's right. You don't give them the whole document. What points would you emphasize to leadership about what the Yates memo actually says? And then, like Marjorie says, you de-lawyer it and say, what does it really mean? Debbie?
I think it means that ultimately they're responsible.
Yeah.
And I think they need to step up to the plate and realize that they're responsible and quit, blaming it on everyone else in the organization. Take some responsibility. I know I've been teaching compliance for 20 years, and for 20 years I've asked the same question every time we do Compliance 101, and the question is, what is your biggest obstacle to compliance? If any of you have been in my class, you've heard that question. And undoubtedly, every time I ask the question, the answer is lack of buy-in and commitment from the top. So I think you use this memo as another reminder that, hey, we need buy-in, we need commitment, and yes, you are ultimately responsible.
And we need to add to that the thought that they are the people that the rest of the organization looks to see for guidance. And
That's that tone at the top.
It is. Oh, we don't like that phrase, I thought.
But it is.
20 years ago, I was a compliance officer at the University of Wisconsin, and my boss was a very bright individual, a Harvard law degree and a Wharton MBA, regular guy, but very well attuned to what was going on. And 20 years ago, by the way, I was walking down the hall with him. He was reading the Penn State University first settlement associated with the healthcare system. And he said in this corporate integrity agreement, it says you should, that they're going to have to hire a compliance officer. And he said, maybe that would be a good thing for us to do before they come. Why don't you do that? And that's how I got into it. But I love this guy, and I supported leadership strongly. And there was a CEO who was a physician who one day said something in a meeting that could be perceived as derogatory towards and unsupportive of compliance programs. I went to my boss. I said, look, part of my job is to help you folks stay out of trouble, in my opinion. That I have to warn you about things maybe like the Yates memo, and that you're being targeted, and that there are people in this company that are going to push you to the edge of the rule of law, maybe push you over the edge of the rule of law. I see my job as keeping the medical director here out from underneath that situation where the investigators come in, they ask the mid-level management, who here blocked the progress of compliance? Well, the medical director said this derogatory thing about compliance. I said, I can't have that. It's my responsibility to help you folks. He said, go see him. I went and sat down with the medical director. I said, you said this statement. Someday there'll be an investigation. They will ask people who was not supportive. They will quote you, even though you maybe didn't mean it as badly as it sounded. Part of my job is to help you. And I can't have you saying these things. And he said, thank you. And
Now, what did he mean by that, Roy? Was he glad?
Oh, thank you. I'll interpret as thank you. His thing is, this is 20 years ago, I need somebody tied at the hip to help me stay out of trouble. And I think that's one of the things I would say, if you're going to go share anything about the Yates memo or anything with your leadership about your role, is to say, part of my role is to help you. And this leads to the next question. If I was a CEO, I am a CEO. Yeah, it's,
That's right.
talk about going over to the dark side. I want people telling me when there's problems. I want people telling me we got to fix something. I want people tied at my hip saying, I know what you're up to, I know what you're doing, and here's something you got to do differently. I believe that the Yates memo, if it turns out to be more meaningful than the previous memos, is that the leadership are going to think that we are an asset, not a cost center, and that they personally should have somebody tied at their hip helping them through this regulatory and ethical maze. So I'll ask you folks, do you think that compliance professionals in the future, and by the way, to be able to do all that I just said, you have to have a seat at the table. If you don't have a seat at the table, you don't even know what they're doing. You can't warn them. Do you think in the future that compliance professionals will have a greater seat at the table, be involved in the meetings the 2 years before the acquisition, or the year before the merger, or the moment the product is being developed, as opposed to post-mortem? Do you think there will be a greater seat at the table and more involvement?
Yes.
I'm hopeful. Yes.
I hope so.
I love it. I'm
I
hopeful.
can visualize it.
This is slow progress.
Well, here's the thing, Roy. It's very enlightened of you to say that as the CEO, you would welcome people to tell you that you have no clothes on. The emperor has no clothes. That is not the human nature of most people at the top, because they get used to sycophants telling them they're so cute, they're so pretty, they're so handsome, they're so
It's
smart.
okay if people still tell me that.
Yeah. Yeah.
They must be millennials.
They're millennials. They're not baby boomers. So I don't want us to think that we got an easy job. We are constantly going to be the ones that may get pushed back and told we're crazy and everything like that. But we need to hold hands and understand we are performing a value for the company and for that CEO, whether they recognize it or not. Now, I'm hoping as an institutionalized position, there will become, even if begrudgingly, like there is for GCs or somebody else, a necessary person to be there. So I would love to think they're going to fall in love with us, but I think we're still going to continue to find our strength in each other and our will to live and to keep on in understanding that we bring a lot of value. I am hopeful we'll be at the table.
You know, I think that a lot of times we have to earn our place at the table.
Yeah.
I think what we do a lot of times is we go into organizations and we think we are going to that board meeting. Oh, no, you're not, okay? You've got to earn the spot. You've got to earn it. I can remember in one of the positions that I've had recently, I started with the organization, and they told me, now, Debbie, you will never be on the leadership team. You will never be there. They've never let a compliance officer be there. Boy, that was my challenge.
Yep.
So I started just doing little things, going up and meeting with the chairman and taking, like the Yates memo, I haven't taken that yet, but taking something like that to them and just being there every time they needed me. And all of a sudden I find myself getting a note, would you please come to the leadership team meeting? So I think a lot of times, you know, we go in with the expectation that, hey, we're it. We're the end all, we're be all, we are the compliance officer. When no one in your organization really cares. All right, so I think what you have to do is earn the credibility, earn the commitment, and get yourself a seat at the table.
I think it is a profound advice. I'll add that Debbie shared is we spend a lot of time, I do. If anybody's read anything I've written, I lament a lot, otherwise known as whining. And I really should spend more time talking about this is our 20th year in a 1,000-year journey. And we need to do what Debbie and all these folks are advising us to do is understand we all have a different future. We're all in a different place. We all have to go in and push the rock. Everybody here is going to make this profession what it is. Not this group, not this association, but everybody here is going to make the profession what it is. If you believe what Debbie just said, we are going to define the role of the compliance officer and the function of the compliance program. And really what Debbie is saying, if we get in to have a seat at the table or more respect by leadership or more support by leadership, it's going to be as a result of us doing what she said is the long pole of trying to convince leadership. This is a lot of leadership. A lot of companies are represented here. If you all go back and try a little trick that Debbie suggests, or you learn at this conference, that next month in this country, there will be movement.
And guys, it took me 3 years to get to the table.
Yep.
So it doesn't happen overnight, so don't get discouraged.
Shifting gears a little bit, we have 150 people here from probably about 35 different countries. I can't remember how many.
Yep.
And we're talking about the Yates Memo. And the Yates Memo is a U.S. thing, and the Department of Justice, even their attitude, which is really what the Yates Memo is, it's not the rule of law. And sometimes I fret over the fact that it's not all about U.S. law, and frankly, there's some sessions here about the EU privacy laws that aren't U.S. laws, but people in the U.S. have to pay attention to those laws. It's an interesting thing that's occurring around the world, is we're all writing laws, and the attitude 20 years ago was, I don't need to follow your stinking laws. I don't think that that's the case today. I think the case today is that what we're having to do today is to pay attention to laws all over the world, from wherever we are to the rest of the world. Are you seeing that? Do you believe that?
You know, at a lot of the academies, we run into the same answer. We've talked to people that are multinational, and how do you worry about all these laws? And we have received a lot of people saying, well, you know what we do is we just look at it from a best practice standpoint. We take the toughest law of any country that we do business in, and we raise our bar so that we do business the same way everywhere we are. And that way you've got that best practice. And so that's probably the safest way to go. And we're hearing a lot of that.
And you know, when you talk about global, it's been really interesting in our academies. You know, we teach the same 7 elements. I don't care if you're right here in the U.S. or if you are in Brazil. It doesn't matter. Everyone's sort of going by those same 7 elements. You don't talk about the federal sentencing guidelines in Brazil, but we talk about the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. So it's been interesting to watch them globally, and we teach all over the world, adopt those 7 elements from the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines.
Well, you did mention some foreign laws. One of the strictest, of course, is the UK Anti-Bribery Act. And I was fascinated that one of the charges of prosecution there, or statutes within that act, many statutes in that act, was one called failure to supervise. Now, this is in the concept of bribery, right?
Yeah.
So that concept embedded in that statute says that if you are supervising an individual and that individual commits an act of bribery against the act and you are subject to the act, then the prosecution not only goes against the individual, but the CEO, CFO in the chain that was supposed to be accountable for that individual's conduct. And because the legal definition is failure to supervise, that's the act. So the CFO gets prosecuted, the CEO gets prosecuted for failing to prevent the act from occurring. Now, that's a hard thing to defend, right? Because when you deal with the criminal law, you're dealing with the actions of one person or 2 people or whatever many that have deliberately decided to hell with your rules in the company, to hell with the law, and we're going to do this in order to benefit the company by crossing that line. Now, there's no compliance officer in the world that can stop someone who's intending to commit a criminal act. So the only defense that we have is to say, well, you know, we did our best, like the Morgan Stanley case. This guy was trained on our policies 35 times. Okay, he deliberately decided to go against that policy. Well, the fact that we had processes and procedures in place, and we can't forget our role, right? The fact that we tried to guard against that behavior was what saved Morgan Stanley from being prosecuted as a company. But what the Yates memo says is, well, even though you didn't prosecute the company, if there were individuals who were responsible for not supervising that person, who were responsible for giving that person the authority to do that, then they should be prosecuted and will be prosecuted as well. And that may be a foreign concept to those outside the U.S., but when you look at what compliance is designed to do, is to focus on behaviors that put a company at risk, it's really not that difficult to understand that memo or not, we are still responsible for the same thing.
Marjorie.
I think this is something going to be unique to our profession, and I think we have to keep pushing it, is the sentencing guidelines started off talking about criminal behavior. This profession has taken that beyond the law and say, let's not talk about government, let's talk about laws, although we're always going to do that, but that standard is down here. Let's apply compliance to the laws of our company. That's much bigger, okay? And that is a global thing. So you don't have to have a lawyer come in and brief what are the laws on anti-corruption in 150 countries. You, as Art said, you obviously find out what's the toughest. You make sure your policy is at least that. But then you think, where do our values take us on that? And that is a global thing. So wherever DuPont is globally, India, Brazil, wherever, this is how we're going to act, okay? I think this is really appealing to management, because management always says, government, they're always telling us what to do. Well, you don't want government in your pants. You figure out your values and your rules that make you. I think that gives you a competitive advantage. You last longer, people are more inspired by it, and that doesn't take a lawyer. That's a group of people that we are that know how to change people's behavior through training, through policies, through auditing, through all those things. So that's my future stuff.
We got started a little bit early. We're going to end a few minutes early, give you a little bit longer break. I'm going to do two things now. One is I'm going to ask Odell. He has this concept of being relevant that I'd like him to share to close the whole thing out for us, which I think might be the most important thing to think about and hope for the future of compliance programs and compliance professionals is its relevancy. And then, after Odell's done, I'm going to award a trophy to the most effective panelist out of these four. Odell, would you talk a little bit about...
Yeah, well, I'll give you the context. Several years ago, I was sitting on a panel, and I believe the question was, of your years of experience in compliance, what's the most important asset or characteristic that you could bring to your role? And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, be relevant. And so, well, what does that mean? And so the way I would explain it to you is like this. Consider yourselves all professional athletes, right? And each one on a team has a certain position on that team, but you're expected to produce results for the company, and you're expected to be a factor in the game. And when I say be relevant, I say, well, you got to be a factor in the game. You're being hired to do a very unique job. Some people don't know what your job is. Others do know what your job is, but you have to know when and where to either speak up, when and where to be silent, or when and where to be strategic and get your view across to others who are going to be more likely to be heard in carrying that view. So when I say be relevant, it means be a factor. Understand where your business is going. Understand what kind of business you're in. do alerts so that you know when things happen in the public about your company, so that you are in the company's sites for understanding what's going on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes being relevant means being in a meeting not saying anything because you don't have anything to add. But what you want to end up with is when you do speak up, people listen to what you say, and you have that ability to persuade them to maybe change their mind and do it in a way that you think is better. So being relevant is a concept as well as a practice. It's important. We were talking earlier about compliance officers, but really a lot of compliance is about your own individual personalities and how you relate to management, whether they trust you, whether they think you're Chicken Little saying the sky is falling all the time, or there he goes again, is this guy out of control? Why should we listen to him? You got to understand, you're in a business. That business is there to make money. And you have to help them make the money in a way that doesn't get them slammed in a prison cell or doesn't get them somehow debarred or face the ultimate consequence. So understand your roles, understand who you're dealing with, understand that, compliance may not be the first thing on that CEO's mind. He may be dealing with a number of other things. And so you have to figure out when is the appropriate approach to get your point across so that when that CEO, he or she says, oh, wow, the compliance guy is speaking, I should listen.
Odell, I want to thank you for helping close this out.
Can I say one thing,
Please
Roy?
do.
Just one thing. I was sitting here listening to Odell and listening to everything we said, and I came up with one thing. And I think the future of compliance depends on you, on everyone in this room. Yep. And one thing that we haven't done this time that I want to do real quickly is everyone that is certified in the profession, one of the certifications, just stand up. Let's give them a hand, guys.
Oh, my God.
Good?
Fantastic.
Well, I want to thank this panel. I really appreciate your wisdom. It's now come time to recognize the most effective panelists.
I didn't think you were serious.
But I've changed my mind. I don't think there should be one winner. So you are all going to get a participation trophy. Please, thank you very much.